Hey guys, and welcome back to my Golf It tutorial series. Today I want to go more in depth on tools and techniques that you can use to turn your map from an empty, flat plane that has a few lanes on it to its own fleshed out world that is full of life and atmosphere. To start off, I just want to go over a couple more tabs on the Objects menu that you can use to add some dynamic and interesting bits to your course. The first one we're going to take a look at, if we hit Tab and go to Dynamic Lanes, we have a few different options here. We have Dynamic Lane Walled, Dynamic Lane One Wall, Dynamic Lane Simple, and Dynamic Wall. We're going to go with the Dynamic Lane Walled, but everything I'm about to show you here can be applied to any of these. So we'll select that, and at first it just looks like a regular lane with two walls. But if we place it down here, rotate it accordingly, what this allows us to do, you'll see we have these points that come up. And what you can do with these is the large ones here, you can click and you can drag them and move them just like you would any other object. And what that does, as you can see, is it creates a sort of curve and a bend in the track to line it up with, say, like a higher level, like in this case here. And once you have that, what you can do is you can right-click on it, and these smaller points here, you'll notice the large one has two smaller points on either side, both at the top and the bottom, and we can click on those and drag those as well to change the intensity of the curve on those points. You can also move them up and down, create little humps or more like divots, but we'll keep them relatively flat. We'll drag them out and make the curve just a little less harsh on the ball, give it a bit more smooth of a curve up to the top there. Now, as a quick tip, if you wanted to get rid of this gap, which I usually like to do, it makes it feel more solid, gives it more structure, is you can click on this and you are Alt drag to make copies, and just make a few copies until it fills up the gap all the way down the space, just like that. And you see now it's fully filled in, nice and solid, gives you a good structure to work off of. Now, another thing I want to go over with dynamic lanes is when you have one of the large points selected and you're dragging the beginning of the end point around, if you use your mouse wheel to scroll, you can change the angle and essentially twist the lane to line up in many different crazy types of ways. You can get really crazy with it. Move it basically wherever you want. Still drag it up and down, and so there's really so many possibilities you could do with dynamic lanes. Now, for adding obstacles to your courses, there's a lot of different options you can do. So if we hit Tab and go into the Obstacles tab, we have all of these to choose from, but they are relatively basic, so I won't go too in depth into them. So let's go, for example, let's choose this pyramid one. Kind of interesting, kind of funky looking. But we can go ahead and place this down. You can see in this lane here, it's pretty much a straight shot all the way around. So we can make it a little more difficult by placing it and maybe even putting it at an angle. So if you hit it, you bounce off in an unwanted direction, making the stakes a little higher if you accidentally bounce into it. We place that down, play. So now you have a little bit more narrow of a gap. Still easy enough to get through, but if you were to hit it, obviously it's going to derail your ball pretty bad. Now, some other obstacles we can add are actually going to be in the Gameplay tab, and these that we're going to go over are the Rotator, Timed Rotation, and Master Transformer. We'll start with the Rotator, and what that does, we'll bring up this mesh here. Once we place it down, you can see by default it adds this plank of wood. Now, if we right-click on this, we can change the mesh, and it'll bring up our object menu. You can see it's a little scaled back. Since it doesn't have all the gameplay elements and other things, it's just the physical objects. So if, for example, just as a random, off the top of my head, let's go to Mines, and let's go to Rocks. Let's go to Environment. Grab one of these crystals. See, it spins. It's also very big. So obviously, like anything else, we can scale it down, we can rotate it, do everything else you would with any other physical object. As you see, now we have a little thing that rotates. And you can make this any mesh you want. Any lanes, foliage, rocks, landscape, all these different themes as well. You can use something like that. You can get really crazy with it. Create some sort of interesting obstacle with the rotator. And the options here, you can have the rotation rate, which is the direction and the speed at the same time. So right now we're rotating on the z-axis at a rate of 180. If we put that to 0, you see it stops. If we rotate along the y, it'll rotate along the y. Same with the X. And you can even combine these at different rates to create some really interesting types of things. The offset is basically changing the point of rotation. So right now it's all at 0, meaning it'll rotate in the center of the object. Let's do a box. We'll keep it simple. Since the offset is all on 0, it's rotating around the center point of the object itself. But if we move that center point outside of the box, you can see it now rotates around a point rather than around an axis. And again, of course, you can do this for, all directions, even up in the air a little bit. So you can create very basic circular paths by doing stuff like that. Now this rotate only when visible. You can see here the little tooltip, but essentially what this means is if you check it, it'll only rotate if it's visible within the camera, and that can be useful if you have a lot of stuff going on in your map that takes a lot of processing power on your PC. So that way it'll only move when it's visible to you. Most of the time you'd probably just want to keep this checked to make it easier load on your computer. But the times I might uncheck it to keep it rotating always, regardless of whether or not you're looking at it, is if your rotation is timed specifically with something that needs to happen at a certain point in time, and you don't want that getting messed up just because you look away, for example. Moving on from the rotator, we have timed rotation, which is similar, but rather than a full cyclical 360-degree rotation, this is more of a forward and back kind of rotation. A pivot around an axis. So as you can see by the default mesh, this cleaver is a good use of that. Going into the options by right-clicking, you can choose the start rotation and the end rotation. So if we choose the start rotation, let's put it 90 degrees up in the air, like so. And then we'll put it 0 right there. And you see now it chops downward. The important thing to keep in mind is the rotation will travel. It won't necessarily always travel clockwise or counterclockwise. It depends on whichever point is closest for it to rotate to. So for example, since we're going -90, which is straight up, to 0, which is down to the side here, if we go -90 to +90, you see it goes all the way down. But as soon as we go 1 degree past that, it's going to go the other way because it is technically now 1 degree closer on the right side. So it'll opt to go that way instead. Unfortunately, there's not a way you can really change that I'm aware of. So just keep that in mind if you're doing a timed rotation like this. Then of course you have your reverse speed and forward speed. It just changes how fast you want things to happen. Our forward speed is 15, so it comes down pretty fast, and reverse is a little slower. It resets at 5. If you make these the same, obviously that just means it'll go up as fast as it goes down. You can mess with those settings and really dial in what kind of feel you're going for, what you want to use it for. Then moving on to our master transformer. This is very useful for a lot of different things. We place this down and we get this wall by default, which is actually what I want to use in this case. I'm going to scale it down just a bit. And you can think of the master transformer as being similar to the rotators, except rather than just rotating around an axis, you can rotate, but you can also change the location and the scale across time. So we have our start, their location, rotation, and scale, and our end, location, rotation, and scale, and then the time it takes between all those things, start delay, pause delay, and all these things like that. I'll go over those fairly quickly here, but in the start, I'll usually leave these all at 0 because it's relative to where you place the object in the map. So the start being 0, 0, 0, that just means it's relative to where you left it, so it's going to stay right there as your start position. Now the end, what I want to do is I want to move it along the y-axis here, and we'll right click and drag the screen to move, and I want it to go over to here, and then under the time we're going to say we want it to forward and reverse, meaning going back and forth from those 2 points. And we'll do 2 seconds on each. Keep it nice and simple. Maybe a bit faster than that. Let's go half. There you go. It seems nice and not too fast, not too slow. You can see that moves back and forth. Start delay is how long you want it to take to actually start moving forward. And then pause delay is how much you want it to delay to start moving back. So if we put each of these at 1 second, you can see it'll delay 1 second to start, and then it'll also delay 1 second to move back. Now you notice it comes right back at the end here because start delay is only applied to the very first time it moves. Finish delay is when it finishes the whole forward and back rotation. So if we want it to stop on this side as well, 1 second there. See, now it pauses for a second. Whoop, it's doing a glitchy thing. There we go. It'll go to each side, pause for a second, and wait. Maybe that's what you want, maybe it's not, but that's how you would do that. And then you have these ease options, both on the start and the end. My favorite is I usually like to do ease in, out. There's a lot of different options you can explore here. They just do different ease animations. I usually like to go with ease in and out for both the beginning and the end. You see there, rather than just go straight across in a linear fashion, it kind of speeds into it and then slows back down at the end, which I usually like that a little bit better. It looks a bit more smooth. So now we've got a nice moving brick that can block your ball depending on where you are. Okay, now we get to my personal favorites, starting with the terrain editor. Now this is where your map really starts coming together. So hit F and go over here to where it says terrain. Now immediately we have this brush that comes up, and there's a few different things you can do here. First of all, going down the list here, we have settings, edit or world settings. Under the world settings, you can change things like the world scale and the voxel size. Now essentially what that means is how big do you want the world to actually be. I personally never have any reason to go bigger than default. And the voxel size, you can see here, this is 1 voxel, and that's basically how you sculpt the world using the brush, is in voxels. You can change the size, which essentially changes the resolution of that sculpt, if that makes sense. Again, I usually don't change these because it's important to keep in mind that the larger your world and the smaller the voxel size, aka the more voxels you have packed into an area, the more processing that'll take, and a lot of times it can really introduce a lot of lag into your game. So I usually don't mess with these settings too much. But we'll go back to the edit, and from here we have tool. We've got surface, sphere, and paint. So essentially, tool and modifier go hand in hand. So if select surface, and then under modifier we have a few. We have add, remove, smooth, or flatten. So just by basic settings, when you open it up, surface and add means it'll add on the surface. Very self-explanatory. But if you change it to sphere, you see it'll add just a whole sphere the exact size of your brush. And same thing with remove. You can remove the sphere shape. It'll just cut out that shape of the sphere. Or you remove the surface, just the topmost bit that your brush is touching, surface. And other modifiers, we have smooth, which this can be really helpful if you have, say a bump here. You can smooth things out and make it less jagged. And now, rather than having a weird gloppy mess, we have a little bit more of a subtle hill. That'll also work with sphere. I do tend to prefer surface when I'm using the smooth modifier. It just tends to work a little bit easier and smoother, for lack of a better term. And then the last modifier we have is flatten. And again, with the surface tool, it'll flatten to the surface. Now, what that means is if I start dragging here on the top of the hill, it'll flatten to that level no matter where I drag. So that could be interesting for creating bumps and valleys, and maybe, for example, we want to go a little bit higher. You can even create something like a land bridge. You start bridging out this way, and that could be useful for creating interesting types of rock formations and other things like that. Another good thing you can use for the flatten and surface tool, it'll flatten at the altitude you start. So if you want to flatten this all back to the ground, you want to start on the ground and then go over with the flatten brush and it'll go back down to being completely flat. And of course, we have the radius here, which will change how big, how small the brush is. And it's just like nothing was ever there. Now, tracing voxel terrain versus all, gonna be honest, I'm not sure what that really does. Voxel terrain is really all you need to worry about when you're sculpting the world. So, I haven't really noticed it do much when you select all anyway. So, again, not sure what that's for. So, I'll just keep that on voxel terrain. So, as a real map example here, I'm going to go ahead and do surface, and we're going to do add. I'm going to keep it at this size. We're going to make a relatively large, kind of just a mountain range around this area. In fact, I might even do sphere in a couple of spots to really, build up a little mountain of sorts. Then, of course, from there, I like to use the surface smooth, and I'll make the radius maybe a little bigger and start to smooth it out. Makes it look less like a bunch of balls everywhere, and actually turns it into some terrain that you can actually work with. And there you can see, once we're down here, we have a little bit of a valley that we're sitting in now. Now, the last thing I want to go over here is the paint tool. Now, essentially, it's, the paint tool. You can select from all these different types of paints. Say for this mountain, if we wanted to do something like rock. Now, I'm also going to make the radius a little smaller. And this is just a way that you can, paint directly on the terrain and build it out into something. So it's not all just the same, grassy hills and stuff. In this case here, I'm creating a mountain, and I'm going to go here to Snowy Rock to make it snow-capped. Very similar to what I did actually in Alter's Valley, my newest map that I've released. So there, now we have a nice mountain. Let's paint it. Looks like a half-decent mountain for someone who worked on it for 5 minutes. But if you take your time and flesh it out, sculpt the terrain how you want, you can also use this to create, for example, you can create rivers, or you can create a pond. You'll make a little divot in here, paint that with dirt or whatever you want, and under the landscape, fill it up with, water. As another quick example, of course. There, pond. Very rough, very quick, but you get the idea. Now, one thing I almost forgot to mention is that with the different types of paints you have here, they're actually different textures and not just a different look. So, for example, if I place down ice right here, if I hit play and then bounce out, you can hear that the sound changes, and it also has different bouncing properties since it's ice. Alright, so one of the last things I want to cover is the foliage brush, which is right here underneath the terrain. It's similar to the terrain in the sense you can adjust the radius and paint over the terrain, but what you're doing is essentially painting with foliage. We can add multiple types of trees here. For example, like if I wanted to do, let's focus on just some shrubbery and maybe some grass, stuff like that. To get rid of the tree here, let's do some clovers. Let's also do a few different types of brackens. I'll throw in a couple different types of flowers as well. So once we have our foliage that we've selected, we can go ahead and start painting. You see, it'll paint with that foliage. Start to really fill up the area. Of course, like everything, there's a plethora of different settings you can change. We have add and remove, which is essentially just your draw or erase, depending on what you need. And we have all these different spawn settings, such as your spawn delay. The more delay, the more time between actually spawning. If you turn that all the way down, you can see it'll spawn lots really quickly. And paint on all voxel terrain, foliage, or other. So paint on all will paint on everything, regardless of where it is. So we paint it on top of the water, we paint it on top of our lanes. So most of the time, you probably don't want that. So usually, I'll paint on voxel terrain. So it'll paint only on the terrain. See, it's underneath the water versus on top of it. Now do keep in mind, it'll still paint on the terrain underneath the lanes. It's connected to the terrain itself, but it's still popping through. So you may need to go through and manually remove any that get in the way if that's the case. So for most cases, I'm just going to use painting on voxel terrain. So I'm going to make the radius a little bit more, and we'll just paint in a patch right here. And maybe a little bit in between as well. One thing I forgot to mention is avoid overlap. You can probably assume what that does. What if I start painting? See, it's just gonna paint on top of everything. So choosing avoid overlap will, of course, avoid overlap. So it's not going to paint on any other existing foliage. So that's useful if you're doing trees and stuff like that, because you probably don't want a big block of wood in the middle of your map. Now I got a couple other things. So that was spawn settings. We have rotation settings, random yaw, random pitch, and then the pitch and yaw amount. And on ground settings, we have align to ground, the maximum amount of slope you want to have, and then the minimum amount of slope. This means that it will align to the ground even if we go up a slope, for example. The max slope being 180, that's just going to be straight up and down. But if we set that to something a bit more shallow, say like 24, you see once we get to a certain point, it's not going to paint in this area because the hill itself is more than a 24-degree incline. Of course, if you uncheck align to ground, it'll align everything flat. But in most cases, you'll want to align the ground so that it aligns to the ground and makes sense. However, if I were, for example, to paint in some trees, and here we still have the trees aligned to the ground, which if it's stylistic and that's what you're going for, obviously that's totally fine. But a lot of times, trees in the real world are not going to grow sideways, so you might want to uncheck that, so that way they will grow straight up. Now, in this case, what you probably have to do is manually move them down, because you will have roots and bottoms of trees not fully in the ground, so you might have to go and manually push them down. Can be tedious work, but it is worth it, I promise. Now, the last thing I want to go over for today is expanding the horizons and really making it feel more like an actual world. Right now we have some foliage, we have some hills, we have a little mountain, got some trees, and even a pond. It's looking a lot better than it did. But if you were to actually come into one of these and start playing, if you look in the distance, there's nothing really out there. It is just a flat plain beyond this little hill that we've got going on. Now, a lot of times what I like to do is I like to go into the landscape tab and I'll select grass hill stretched. I'll place it out here and I'll change the scale of these things to something crazy big, like hundreds. And essentially what this does is it cheats having a bigger map without physically making a bigger map. Like we talked about earlier, that takes more processing and can often lead to introducing lag and other things like that, which you probably don't want. So now you see once we have these planes slid right up to the hills, they kind of disappear underneath them, and it creates a little bit of a natural transition between the edited terrain and the planes that you place down. And it expands it, makes it look a lot bigger than it actually is. Now, another thing I like to do is if we go into the user content tab and under the terrain, we have a bunch of different hills and stuff like that we can choose from. And we do something similar to what I did with the planes, which is expand these to make them really big and essentially create mountains. That's a little tall. Let me scooch that a little bit closer to something a bit more realistic. We do something similar with a few different types of terrain. Once you get all those in place, you can see it really helps create the illusion that this is an actual place rather than just a flat piece of grass floating in an endless sky. Now for the final cherry on top, what I'm going to do is go into level settings and change the fog. I'm going to give a little bit of fog, make it more of the color of the sky. You can see there now we've got some fog in the distance that really emphasizes the fact that those are big mountains are really far away. And it helps create a sense of atmosphere, which I personally really like. That feels pretty good as far as creating the world itself. Now, of course, if you want to go even more detail, you can add other mountains, buildings, structures out in the distance here if you'd like to add. But for now, I'm going to focus more on the course itself. Looks great. It's definitely an improvement from where it was before. We're going to add just a few more things to help bring it to life. One of those things, of course, are environment pieces. There's plenty of these to go around, and depending on the feel you're going for, there's also, you can choose from different themes here. We got mines, we got tracks, crystals, all these from Pirate Cove elements, Jade Temple, all sorts of stuff. I'm going to stick to grassland for now. And all the buildings and different houses that come with the place are usually, they're pretty nice, in my opinion. Maybe I'll find one to put next to the pond here. And I think something like this might be nice. Nice little tower, kind of facing out that way. I think that looks pretty good. Now, another great thing you can do with things like this, say if I choose house 1, for example, you notice it has this little archway. Now, I can rotate this arch, and I can place it around our course. Now, doing something like this creates more of a sense of, there's an inside and there's an outside. So simply by adding an arch, we've changed nothing about the course or how it operates, but simply by adding this, it now feels a lot more dynamic because now we're putting through something else rather than just across the green. So that helps add a dynamic that can be really fun. Alright guys, so I've taken about an hour or so to add some final touches. I've added more foliage both with the brush and also manually added things like trees and other buildings and things like that. I've also added in some details like this watermelon patch next to our first hole, some fish, some rocks, and a boat in the pond to give it some more life. And my personal favorite, these minecart tracks leading out from the mountain, complete with an actual minecart that I've animated across using events. And if you'd like to see how that's done, be sure to subscribe for when that tutorial comes out. And lastly, as you guys may have noticed, I've redone the paint on the terrain, and I've changed the wall texture on the lanes to better fit the theme. So that's going to about do it for this tutorial. I know this was a lot to pack into one video, so if you guys have any questions about anything I've covered, leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to help. Of course, don't forget to subscribe for more tutorials and maps that I'll be releasing later on. With that being said, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.